I think in the beginning of the war, we all heard that word, not provoked or unprovoked, unprovoked.
No.
Of course, the word, I mean, it was provoked. There is no doubt about that now. But
I'm
the fact of the matter,
fundamentally against that.
I'm
I
sorry?
think it was provoked, and I speak from many years of experience negotiating in that area. And I was one who opposed NATO expansion from the very
you are
beginning
saying,
because I
sure.
predicted it would create
Yes,
such
yes.
things. So let's get off that. If you want my opinion, I'll give
Sure.
it.
Good evening. We have a very special program for our viewers today in Georgia, in the region, and around the world. We have an ambassador, former ambassador to the Soviet Union, Mr. Jack Matlock. Among many other achievements and postings, Ambassador Matlock served as the United States top diplomat to the Soviet Union from 1987 and 1991. With his duties in Moscow ending only months before the dissolution of the country itself. He was famously working with President Reagan and Bush Sr. to end the Cold War, which he keeps emphasizing happened due to mutual agreement and good diplomacy, not because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I would just let our audience know that the last part is perhaps the most important part in Mr. Matlock's diplomatic statecraft. Ambassador, thank you once again for being with us. I would like to congratulate you on your 95th birthday and wish you many, many more happy and healthy years ahead of you.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm very happy to be with you today because I've always taken a special interest in Georgia. And I would say Georgians have played a very important role, not only in my diplomacy, but in my personal life. So it's very happy to be able to speak to a Georgian audience today.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. And we're truly honored to have you. So let's dive right into it. The world is, to say the least, experiencing some changes. You have a detailed, storied knowledge of what used to be the former Soviet Union and now Russia. You also are a keen observer of current events, global events that are shaping this changing international system. We have a conflict. We have the conflict in Ukraine as a result of Russia's invasion, and we have unstable political environment, to say the least, in Georgia, a small country that is dealing with regional realities to the best of its ability. My first question to you is, how do you see the two conflicts, the Russo-Ukrainian conflict that is currently taking place, and the 2008 conflict, Russia's invasion of Georgia that happened in 2008 of August? Do you see any similarities in terms of causal mechanisms?
I think they have different causes.
They had different causes.
Different causes. The 2008 invasion by Russia occurred after Saakashvili attacked peacekeepers in South Ossetia. Now, that conflict in South Ossetia began while the Soviet Union was still there, and Gamsakhurdia, who had more or less taken control of Georgia, in effect started military action against Khinvali. And in the winter of 1990-91, they actually surrounded Khinvali and tried to blockade it. So the basic problem there was Georgia was trying to do to its own minorities what it accused Russia of doing it to it. And I think this was the root of the problem. At the same time, of course, just after Georgian independence, there were attempts by Georgians, people like Kutovani, to attack the parliament in Abkhazia, so that in effect, Georgia itself started some of these internal violences, so that there was a provocation, I would say, in the case of the attack on Valley. It is something, by the way, that I'm told my colleagues who were later American ambassadors to Georgia had strongly advised against. But so I think that one can say that Russia went too far, shouldn't have gone so far. But in effect, Georgia started that. And it's a tragedy for everybody, as it turned out. Now, Ukraine was quite different. The Ukraine invasion never should have happened. There was an attempt by the United States and the EU to begin to control Ukrainian politics, to bring them away from Russian influence. That was foolhardy. The United States would never have tolerated the extension of a foreign military base anywhere in our hemisphere.
That's right.
And we proved back during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union legally put nuclear missiles on Cuba, we threatened war. Now, I say legally because we had previously deployed nuclear missiles in Turkey that could reach the Soviet Union.
Correct.
So that there was nothing illegal about this. However, it was unacceptable. Unfortunately, Khrushchev and Kennedy were able to come to an agreement. And Khrushchev had to promise to remove those missiles from Cuba and publicly, and Kennedy promised to remove the missiles from Turkey, but that was not to be announced. In other words, he forced Khrushchev to look as if he had been defeated, when in fact he hadn't.
When you say unacceptable,
I just want to continue. I was
Sure.
in Moscow at that time and had no idea how close we came to nuclear war. All right, let's get back to Ukraine. In 2014, there was a start of violence in the West against, there were demonstrations, of course, in Kiev and so on, and demonstrations of people who wanted to join the EU. Now, it was clear that Ukraine could not at that time join the EU, and it didn't meet the requirements. And the proposal that the EU gave them was actually far short of guaranteeing entry, but it did require them to do a number of things internally which were politically impossible. At the same time, Russia offered a much more generous offer. Now, the people on the streets thought that, well, this was a matter of turning down the opportunity to join the EU, which they assumed would mean that it would solve all of their problems, which it absolutely would not have, because their problems were internal. They were a deeply divided nation in terms of defining what means to be Ukrainian. And the attempt of violence beginning in the West, because Ukraine did not have a federal system of the sort that other countries with, you might say, divided populations have, like the United States, for example. If we have an elected president, the president cannot appoint the governors of states. People in the states vote for them. And other countries that have, you might say, mixed nationalities, protect the rights of others. You take Finland. they have a Swedish minority, but the Finnish cultural heritage is protected. That they have their rights the same as the Finnish-speaking people, or Belgium, where you have Flemings speaking something close to Dutch, and then the Wallons speaking French, and they don't. They give them sort of equal rights, whereas in Ukraine you had an attempt of those in the West. Former Galicia and the adjoining provinces, which had never been part of the Russian Empire, but were included by a gift by Stalin and Hitler in just before World War I. And of course, these areas under the communist system led initially, of course, from the late 20s by a Georgian, Joseph Stalin, very much suppressed the cultures of those Ukrainians in the West. However, those in the East, these Ukrainians, many of them spoke Russian and had been in the Russian Empire for several centuries. And they're in Ukraine from the very beginnings of independence, which was handed to them. They didn't have to fight. And who led that independence? The elected leader of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin. So to say that the Russians always suppress things, actually the Russian leader was responsible for breaking up the Soviet Union and giving the various oblasts, given the various Union republics their independence. So this idea of demonizing Russia is not a good idea. You can agree or not agree with current policies, but the idea that Russia is always imperialistic and Russia is trying to sort of completely expand is not. These are very special things, and it's clear that Russia will always consider the territory of what is now, you might say, Eastern Ukraine and Belarus as very special, something that doesn't necessarily apply to others. Now, but at the same time, it was clear that it was the United States and Western policy to deeply interfere in Ukraine's governance. We promised a lot of aid, but on condition that certain people be like the prosecutor general be fired. And it happened that our current president, who was then vice president, was personally involved with efforts to also as to who joined the Ukrainian government. So that the coup d'etat that actually occurred in February 2014 was seen by Russia, not just by Vladimir Putin, but by most Russians, as the result of American influence, not just the CIA, but very overt influence in trying to separate Russia from, separate Ukraine from Russian influence. That was simply unacceptable, and it would have been unacceptable to virtually any Russian government that had widespread support in that country. So that, and even after that, there was later, at that point, this led to the demands by Ukraine, the request to join NATO. Now, let me go back to that. And
let me just briefly interrupt here, if I may.
Just briefly, all right, I'm getting too long. The war did not have to happen, and it was precipitated by an attempt, you might say, by the United States and what we call the West to separate Ukraine from Russia. Now, the whole thing is a tragedy now, and for reasons that I don't have time to explain. Now that leads me to say that right now, I think that it is extraordinarily important for Georgia and also the other countries of the Transcaucasus to avoid taking sides in what is becoming a civilizational struggle. I don't think it is necessary. I don't think it is in the interest of those parties. I think that Georgia needs good relations with all of its neighbors. It needs more respect for its own minorities, and it needs to understand that its problems are not going to be solved by becoming a member of the European Union. It may someday, I hope it does. And nothing in Russian policy prohibits that. But NATO is a no-no. And it seems to me that one has to understand also that the United States is very much overextended now in the guarantees it's been giving. And as an American, I don't think that is good for any of us because we must look for peace and we must look for ways to solve our problems peacefully without violence and without war.
Let me just to the point of separatism in Georgia real quick. I much appreciate and our audience will appreciate your honest appraisal of the reality that we have to face. However, to what extent Russia, to what extent it's only the Georgian sort of nationalism is the cause of possible separatist movements. It's impossible basically to marginalize Russia's role in it. Who provoked who? Of course, it's a thing that needs to be further looked at by historians. But Russia's part in this, I would imagine, is it's obvious. It's also a major part in Georgia's separatism. This is not to say, however, that through some shrewd pragmatism and diplomacy, there might not be down the road, years from now, perhaps, an opportunity to reconstitute and reconstitute Georgia's territorial integrity. Although it's still, unfortunately, kind of a wishful thinking. But I think Russia's role in the region has always been about keeping its own geopolitical, national security, strategic interests, making sure that no Western power could come in under its sort of soft underbelly, call it the South Caucasian region, knowing its history of how vulnerable that region is. But be that as it may, Ambassador, in today, you've alluded to this, that Russia will never give up Ukraine, let alone let it become a member of NATO, because this is an existential
I didn't say Russia would never give up Ukraine. I said that Ukraine is divided and Russia will not let Ukraine be a member of a foreign military
alliance. By giving up,
as the United States would not let any country in our hemisphere be a member of a foreign military alliance. The problem is the militarization of this.
Yes,
one has to understand that. And also, I would say, the idea that you solve these things by violence will not happen.
Absolutely not.
Let's get away from this idea. The only thing that is going to help Georgia is to begin to build its own economy and its own, you might say, culture and basis in a way to be friendly to all sides and not get involved in some so-called civilizational struggle.
No,
For
absolutely.
example, there's nothing at all wrong with the Chinese building a port, particularly when the Western investors didn't meet their requirements. Why be objective to that? The Chinese are not going to exploit you, and to say that, and so I don't say that everything Russia does is good. It necessarily isn't, but Russia is acting exactly as the United States would act if it saw a hostile military action near its borders. You've got to understand that. So,
Absolutely.
Georgia
Ambassador, I just don't want to. I don't want it to be a sort of a misunderstanding here. It is absolutely we are on the same wavelength when we talk about Russia's interests, national security interests, and the idea of NATO moving towards its borders. I mean, I think there is a consensus about that, and I think the fundamental reason why this Ukrainian tragedy took place and the whole idea of Russia invasion was not provoked. I think in the beginning of the war, we all heard that word, not provoked or unprovoked, unprovoked.
No.
Of course, the word, I mean, it was provoked. There is no doubt about that now. But
I'm
the fact
fundamentally against that.
I'm sorry?
I think it was provoked, and I speak from many years of experience negotiating in that area. And I was one who opposed NATO expansion from the very beginning because I predicted it would create such things. So let's get off that. If you want my opinion, I'll give it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, so you agree with the idea that it was a it was a provocation, obviously. I mean, yeah, this is how I look at it. And so there were plenty of warnings. Anyone from George Cannon when he was still around to Bill Perry, Bill Burns. I mean, everyone warned. Today's the CIA chief. Bill Burns, that he was an ambassador to Russia years ago, and everyone worried about to repeat his quote, NATO's expansion was the brightest of red lights for Russia. And so this is absolutely a consensus in the international affairs literature, and some serious people who analyze this stuff, that Putin did not just wake up one day and go into Ukraine just out of the blue, obviously. But what is your But I think there is a consensus on that now. So that's my point. But what do you think, Georgia, a small state, a defenseless state, a weak state in a very hostile neighborhood? Let's be honest with each other. Should do in such a situation? I mean, we have the Black Sea region and Georgia's Black Sea coast that represents a strategic value for for Georgia. And how do you see Western and particularly United States role in this Black Sea region vis-a-vis Russia's interest in the Black Sea region? And just to make one point, there is a very good conceptual sort of theoretical concept that is being developed in the University of Sukhumi State University in Tbilisi, Georgia, that talks about taking out sort of the South Caucasus, as making it as a relatively independent state where just geoeconomic projects would be welcomed, and not as one space where specific countries will be plucked out for the interests of major powers to pin them against each other. So there are some academic concepts at work. Honelidze's concept is called, that is basically discussing these issues for Georgia to move forward, because this region has to somehow become turned into a peaceful, sort of geoeconomically oriented region where surrounded parties and neighbors can make money and profit from each other without actually turning the region into some perpetual sort of a military haven. This being said, I agree with your overall sort of take on where Georgia should be, but could you give us a better idea as to we already talked about fundamental differences between Georgia and Ukraine and how these conflicts started. So in order to avoid this in order to avoid this again, in order to increase chances for security, what is your opinion? Do you think United States should do what exactly? Should it look at the region? How? I mean, what is the purpose of the United States in the region at this point? Are there any specifics that you can offer?
I think that the United States should offer good relations with Georgia, should offer economic assistance as it is needed, but should avoid involvement in Georgian internal politics. I think that never works.
Mhm.
And I think that one of the problems that we see today is the sort of attempt to, what is said, spread democracy. An outsider cannot spread democracy
Right.
because anytime an outsider gets involved in somebody's politics, you hurt the people you're trying to help because it looks as if they're foreign agents. Now, I know that, so I would hope the United States would have a good relationship with Georgia and would continue to supply economic assistance and humanitarian assistance as it was needed. I think this is very important. But I don't think we should be financing organizations that are deeply involved in the internal politics. I think that's going to make them suspect of others, even if what they're trying to do they think is the right thing. So that I think we should be staying out of domestic politics. I might say that as far as the current situation, I just read this morning, I think, a very perceptive article that published by the Quincy Institute in Washington by Anatol Levin, Almat Rochovansky, and Artin Dersimonian. I recommend that to all of your listeners because I think that gives a very balanced view of what's going on. Among other things, the law requiring registration of organizations that receive foreign funds is very similar to laws in the United States. It is not like the laws that Putin has put in Russia, which extends far beyond foreign financed organizations. The United States itself is now requiring registration in foreign financed organizations. I think that's bad. But if the current Georgian government is doing it, they're doing nothing different from what our own country is doing. So to say that that is bad, or even worse, to sanction the Georgian government because of it, I think is wrong. And I deplore that.
I think a lot of
viewers. One issue taken up in this article, I very much recommend it.
Yes, absolutely. I think to your last point, that about the sanctions, it's a good reminder. I was about to ask you the next question on the economics front. You remember quite well that when the war started, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was an onslaught, huge pressure, allegedly, by the U.S. foreign policy folks focusing on Georgia and the region, for Georgia to join in the sanctions against Russia. And the most obvious and common sense question that came out of Georgia, out of this controversy, was that how does the United States expect Georgia to survive economically when enormous amount of Georgia's GDP, not sure about the exact numbers right now, but just wine alone that the Georgians export allows Georgian businesses to survive off of that export to Russia. Not to mention citrus and other economic and other commodities. But overall, this was such a undiplomatic and rough, sort of careless suggestion that this small economy that's barely on its standing on its legs to participate in sanctions worth of billions of dollars, and then eventually the United States and Europe sort of started to step back. And to that end, I just wanted to say one more thing about the NGOs, because you mentioned non-interference in domestic politics. And one of the instruments of interfering into domestic politics in Georgia has been this sort of this enabling of the NGO sector. Now, I have nothing against NGOs, in a Western sense, the way they act, say, in the US or in Europe. They're doing a fine job in analyzing and identifying sociocultural problems, political problems, etc. But in Georgia, they've had this extreme power, I would say, to basically bring the state to the state of paralysis. If they don't like or disagree with the current government. I would imagine you probably would agree that this is a wrong-headed policy to empower a certain segment of the society to escalate the political situation to the point of yet another possible revolution. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that is most unfortunate that things have developed that way. I think it was absolutely correct for Georgia not to join in the sanctions regarding Ukraine. By the way, these sanctions are not bringing about what they were supposed to.
Yes.
They're not bringing about a collapse of the Russian economy. They are bringing about actually a strengthening of authoritarianism and a reassessment of things. After all, before the Ukrainian invasion, which was provoked, in my opinion, Russia was cooperating with the United States in many areas, such as with North Korea, with Iran, and now they're making allies of them. I think that is bad. That is bad for the West. It is bad for all of us. You said earlier, now, what I say now is that I think that it has been absolutely wrong for the United States to attempt these, you might say, boycotts, because you are quite right, they would have been disastrous for Georgia. And the United States simply cannot pick up all the slack. Georgia is where it is. Georgia is there between Russia and Turkey. By the way, Turkey is a NATO member and also did not join in these boycotts and is profiting from it, because Russians are now traveling out through Istanbul. Turkish Airlines is doing very well, and so on. So that I think that, yes, the problems of the South Caucasus is the divisions among the various people there. They need to work that out peacefully and not constantly trying to sort of one or the other. Of course, we've got this tragic competition between the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis. And again, this isn't profiting anybody. And to think that it's going to be solved by somehow the United States or the EU coming in to help is simply not going to happen, because the problems are local. And so what I would say is that it does seem to me that it is quite reasonable for Georgia to cultivate, you might say, at least a respectable relationship with Russia without thinking that it can be part of some overall struggle which distorts things. I think that one must have to recognize that although Georgia might have required the registration of foreign-funded, even in part.
It's a very controversial law, yes, sir.
They have not closed those NGOs.
Exactly.
I mean,
exactly.
Georgia hasn't gone nearly as authoritarian as Russia has. And I think we have to recognize that. And I think that that calls that you're having that to somehow to reverse whatever happens in the coming elections are absolutely should be unacceptable.
Yes.
Also, I think it should be unacceptable for the winner to take revenge against the others. The Georgians just as Americans have to begin to learn to abide by majority rule. Our own country is deeply divided now. And an election which is now so close nobody can predict it, with the stakes very high. And it does seem to me that the important thing here is, yes, go through fair voting, count them fair, and then keep the opposition should stay free to continue to oppose policies it wants to, but let's stop thinking ideas that people should remove illegally. I would
Correct.
recall that Shevardnadze was removed a year before his election term rolled out. I think that was a very, very big mistake. I know that his regime had certain problems, but he took over almost anarchy and brought Georgia back in a way. He was a good friend of mine, and we worked in the Cold War when he was foreign minister. And it seemed to me that the way he was treated at the end was not what he deserved. Anyway, to go through these, I would say today, the idea that somehow the victory of the current Georgia dream should be opposed because it's not democratic, it does not make sense to me. And
it doesn't make any sense to me either, and I'm going to join you on that, because, and then last couple of points, I think you are alluding to this idea that Georgia can figure out itself figure out its future within the region. There is plenty to do within the region, and this sort of this idealist dream that somebody has to pluck Georgia out and let it join NATO. I mean, those dreams have shattered, and they never stood a chance, if you ask me personally. But Georgia sort of had to, conduct its introspective foreign policy, look into its neighborhood, look into the resources. By the way, the resources that Shevardnadze, your great friend, left for Georgia in terms of geoeconomic and pipeline projects that really put Georgia on the radar of the West. Yes, I think it's hard to disagree with you, Ambassador. We only have just less than 5 minutes remaining. Obviously your advice for Georgia to be more pragmatic and more realistic and analyze its foreign policy and its role in the region and in international affairs more astutely and more pragmatically, I think is invaluable. Do you have any last words for us for Georgia moving forward?
Well, it was only to perhaps repeat what you have just said. It's in Georgia's interest to have the best possible relations with all its neighbors and not to involve itself in attempts on one side or the other to divide the world on what they call civilizational grounds. I think that's going to fail. And I think particularly for a small country located as is geographically, it must craft a foreign policy that doesn't make enemies of anybody. And it seems to me that in the long run, that Georgia needs good relations with Turkey, with Armenia, with Russia, and with China and with the United States. And the United States and the West shouldn't be saying that they have to side only with one and be hostile to others. I think that Georgia one day may well qualify for EU membership, and I don't believe that any other country should be able to veto that. But right now, Georgia doesn't. And the requirement of the EU to boycott Russia, I think, has been quite unreasonable. So I think things are going to change because the Ukraine war is not going to last forever. And there's going to be a shakeup after that. I can't predict what American policy is going to be because right now we ourselves are so deeply divided that it's very hard to predict what direction things are going to be.
That would make for another entirely different show just to discuss American domestic politics.
To say that I think Georgians should support a policy that tries to be friends and normal relations with everybody without taking sides in other people's fights.
Ambassador, thank you very much for those wise words and wise ideas that unfortunately have been missing in Georgia for the past 30 years. And I'm sure that we are both on the same page when we say we hope that Georgia will realize that it is only through pragmatic and shrewd politics that it can survive in a very hostile region. Once again, Ambassador Jack Matlock was with us today. Thank you very much, Ambassador. We really appreciate you.
Thank you, and I'll recommend again the article I mentioned.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Surely.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Glad to be with you.